Thursday morning, a week ago. Tanks of the Turkish army on the outskirts of Famagusta are about to complete their victory in Cyprus. The Geneva peace talks have collapsed. The Turks have lost patience, have given up words in favor of war. They will take what they want of Cyprus by force of arms.
This week I went to one of the most fascinating countries on earth.
Wow.
And yet it's a country that not many people know much about.
This is a Turkish bath.
That country is Cyprus, and I traveled to its capital, Nicosia, which stands today as the last divided capital on the planet. My tour guide in the city of Nicosia was a lady called Eleni, a local Polish Cypriot whose home has been abandoned now for over 40 years, along with hundreds if not thousands of others across the island. But how did Cyprus and Nicosia get to this point? How did it end up so divided? Well, that's what I want to explore in today's video, the violent and turbulent history of the island, how the new generation of Cypriots are coping with the division today, and what all of this teaches us about human psychology. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So, to understand how all of these homes in Cyprus became abandoned, we first need to look at Greece. Historically, Greece used to have a huge empire here in the Mediterranean. It spanned from modern-day Greece to Egypt, to Syria and beyond. But over time, this empire has been whittled down, divided and partitioned until we arrived at what we understand to be modern Greece today, which was established in 1830. But the problem with modern Greece is that, well, not everyone is super happy with these borders. There are Greek populations living all over the Mediterranean, and many of them don't like the fact that they live outside of their mother nation of Greece. So by the 1900s, there was a growing movement of reunification of Greek populations with their mother nation. This movement was known as Enosis, and right at the heart of Enosis was this island of Cyprus, where 78% of the population identified as Greek. But 78% isn't 100%, and the second biggest population on the island were the Turkish Cypriots, who occupied about 18% of the population. And well, the Turkish population really didn't want anything to do with Enosis. So instead, the Turkish population proposed that the island should be split into two, with the Turkish population living in the north of the island and the Greek population living in the south, living separately and independently. But resolving this conflict between enosis and division was particularly difficult because, well, neither of these populations actually owned the island. Cyprus, in the first half of the 20th century, unsurprisingly belonged to, you guessed it, Great Britain. By the time of the 1950s, Cyprus had been ruled by Great Britain for over 70 years, and quite frankly, the local Cypriots were fed up of it. During this time, incidents of Cypriot violence against British officials began to escalate, and as they did so, well, Great Britain got the message. It was time to go home. But when Britain tried to leave, it left a huge power vacuum on the island, and the people of the island were divided over what they wanted to happen next. So what does Britain decide to do? Do they side with the Greeks and go through Enosis, or do they side with the Turkish and split the island in two? Well, of course Britain does what nobody actually wants, which is make Cyprus independent. That's exactly what happened in 1960. In 1960, the UK agrees to make Cyprus an independent island, but in order to try and satisfy both parties, they came up with this weird plan where the president of Cyprus would have to be a Greek Cypriot, while the vice president would have to be a Turkish Cypriot, which ended up being this guy, Faisal. When I was in Nicosia, I actually went to go see Archbishop Makarios III's house. It is this big, beautiful home right in the heart of the capital city. But as beautiful as this guy's house was, well, it didn't really make anyone happy on either side. Over the next 3 years, tensions between the two sides would continue to rise, and by 1963 they'd reached a boiling point. An incident occurred where two Turkish Cypriots were killed in a situation involving some Greek Cypriot police officers. And when news of this reached the island, there was a huge outburst of violence among the two sides. This was a violent and tragic conflict, leading to the death of 174 Greek Cypriots and 364 Turkish Cypriots. What made things worse, especially for the Turkish Cypriots, was that many of their homes were burned during all of this violence, and thousands of Turkish Cypriots were displaced from their homes. This, of course, meant that the Turkish population of Cyprus no longer felt safe where they were, and so their migration patterns began to change. Turkish Cypriots began to form clusters around the island, little enclaves where they protected each other, and that's how it remained for the next 10 years, with tensions extremely high between the two sides and a painful and bloody history fresh in the memories of the people living there. By the way, this pattern of migration where ostracized minorities form enclaves is a pattern that we see in computational psychology all the time. It's really surprising how little discrimination you need for this kind of migration pattern to occur and for minorities to feel safer living in enclaves. Okay, but getting back to the history, that's how it remained for 10 years. 10 years they remained in this very high tension enclave environment, and then in 1974, violence broke out again. After 10 years of rule under Archbishop Makarios III as president, a far-right Greek militia performed a coup d'etat, or a military takeover of the government, and put a pro-enosis Greek nationalist in charge.
It's not only a problem of enosis in this moment. It is a problem to make these people to stay in the beliefs of the struggle for freedom.
This violent overthrowing of the government by this far-right Greek militia of course made the local Turkish Cypriot population feel extremely unsafe, and many of the Turkish Cypriot population on the island began to call out to Turkey to come and save them, which is exactly what happened just 5 days later. 5 days later, Turkey sends in a full-force army onto the island of Cyprus, complete with bombs, paratroopers, and more. At first, it seemed like the Turkish army was coming in simply to protect the local Turkish population from being subject to more violence by the local Greek Cypriots.
That is a political question, but I can tell you that anybody here feels secure under only Turkish administration.
But when Turkey came in, they didn't just stop at protection. Instead, they decided to carry on bombing and sending paratroopers, and they full-on started to invade the north of Cyprus.
Nicosia, the capital city of Cyprus, the center of the bitter struggle between Greek and Turk, is engulfed in war.
Over the next 3 days, Turkey continued to push their advances across the island and very quickly took over 36% of all of Cyprus, which included, unfortunately, Famagusta, the hometown of my tour guide Eleni, and this is a day that my tour guide Eleni will never forget.
Something I remember quite well, although I was only 4 years old, but I remember it, have an amazing recollection of those moments. Got a knock on the door, and it was our neighbor, and he basically said, you know, you've got 5 minutes to leave the house, to evacuate. My mom, who was a very young mother at the time, she was only 25 years old. She had us girls, I was 4, my sister was 2. In 5 minutes she had to pack her whole life, and that wasn't easy. The thing is, she thought, and we all thought, that we are coming back. So we thought this is just temporary, and we're going to leave, and you know, this is not a good situation, and we will come back. So we drove off, and we ended up at one of the British bases in Larnaca, and so we left, and we started a new life in the UK. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
One of the most fascinating things that Eleni told me on the day is that there are many minorities living on the island of Cyprus that are largely forgotten by the books of history. The Armenians, the Maronites, and the Latins were all forced to choose a side, even though they identified with neither. This violence that swept across the entire island affected everybody that was on it, and after 3 days of it, the international community stepped in and said enough was enough. What happened when the international community stepped in was an establishment of a ceasefire zone, which is what today you see as this weird jagged line that strips across the middle of the island. To the locals, this is known as the Green Line because, well, a military general by the name of Peter Young simply drew the borders on with a green pencil on a map. But even though it's known as the Green Line, it is not simply a pencil marking on a map. These are people's homes, their families, their memories and their communities stripped away from them and left to rot for over 40 years with nothing that they can do about it. It is a scar and a painful reminder of those few days that the people living in Nicosia think about on a daily basis. But after over 40 years of division, the people of Cyprus look very different to how they did in the 70s. There's a whole new generation of Cypriots who were born after all of this conflict and have never known anything other than the division that exists. Because of this new generation of Cypriots, both on the Turkish and Greek side, it has now become a very complicated conflict to resolve. But many of the younger generation are trying to reunify the country. Parts of this buffer zone, the Green Line, have now become centers for communication and conflict resolution between the two sides. This place that you're seeing now is actually a wedding venue that is in the buffer zone, a place where a Greek Cypriot can marry a Turkish Cypriot in a middle ground that belongs to neither territory. Another beacon of hope is this guy called Stelios, who is best known for being the CEO and owner of EasyJet. And he uses his power and influence as a wealthy Cypriot to try and reunify the two sides through venture capital. He invests in business ventures that have both Greek and Turkish owners working together for a common goal. By working together, he hopes that they can stop seeing each other as Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but just as Cypriots working together. And it is this unique and shifting identity of the people of Cyprus that got me so interested in this conflict in the first place. A few months ago, I talked to one of the leading identity psychologists in the world, a guy called Dominic Packer. And in his book, The Power of Us, one of the key themes is that we all don't just have one identity, but instead we have many. And do people have just one identity?
No. Or at least that's a fundamental part of our argument in the book and in social psychology more broadly, is that identities, for most of us at least, is a pretty multifaceted thing. Poet Walt Whitman once said something like, do I contradict myself? Fine, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes.
What he argues in the book is that depending on the context that we're in, the language that we're using, and the type of behavior that we're executing, different identities can come into focus while others take a back seat. And I think that if we focus on the identities that breed cooperation rather than violence, friendship rather than enemies, unite us rather than divide us, the world would be a lot better place. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.